Okay, I think I'm going to start. So officially, hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. A warm welcome to this session on tackling grand challenges strategically. My name's Gary Burke. I'm at Aston University in the UK, and I'm happy to share this session. We've got 4 great papers today, and the running orders here in this schedule. So we're going to have 40 minutes to present each. 5 minutes for questions. Hopefully we'll get a bit more questions in if the presentations finish sooner. And we've got some general questions at the end, or time for general questions discussion. The idea is I'll invite the other authors or presenters to ask the first question after each paper, and then we'll just open it up to questions. Can I encourage you, as always, to share questions in the chat to sort of stimulate discussion, and I'll try and pick some of those up when we ask questions. Also, you can raise your hand if you want to speak, and of course mute your microphones if you're not listening, if you're just listening to the presentations. But without sort of further ado, with the rules established, can I just invite Fannie to do the first presentation?
Sure thing.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks. I think I would need to stop you from sharing your screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Just jump in.
All right. Okay, sorry, I'll go straight to here. All right, the infamous question, can everybody see this? Are we okay?
Good.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, because it's very early in the morning for me, but good afternoon for those of you who are a little bit farther in Europe. So I'm presenting a paper that I'm co-authoring with Paula, Jarzabkowski, and Jane Lay. Very fortunate to work with these 2 incredible women. The title is Trigger Traps and Disconnect, How Managing Divergent Viewpoints Waylays Progress on Grand Challenges. So you'll probably notice that the title is slightly changed from the one that was submitted. And so is the framing. Big reveals. So there's a lot of work that has been put into this paper in the last couple of months, I would say, because it is currently under review. So we've tried to really rework the framing. So any kind of feedback we can get on framing contributions and the model would be absolutely fantastic, but obviously we'll welcome any feedback at all. So let's see, can I click here? Yep. Okay, so in terms of context, and I've read the papers, there's a lot of great synergies between our papers, because we seem to be saying a lot of the same things, like there is critical challenges to tackling grand challenges, and we're struggling to really understand why. So despite our improved understanding of them, the grocery list of characteristics about grand challenges keeps on getting longer, but we're still failing to make significant progress on them. And there's heaps of empirical studies that are demonstrating that, and are trying to, to unpack those processes that are trying to explain why we're struggling to make significant progress on grand challenges. And with this paper, we're really trying to focus on one of the core complexities that has been flagged in the literature on grand challenges. So integrating divergent views of grand challenge as a core complexity. So we know that grand challenges are global problems that can be plausibly addressed through coordinated efforts. They are evaluative, and so there's a lot of people that will share different understandings of what it means to, well, first of all, to understand this grand challenge, but also to tackle it and develop solutions. But what is interesting about this is that, we notice that there seems to be a tension in understanding the role of divergent views, of integrating those divergent views in the formulation of a response to grand challenge. We see that on the one hand, literature is telling us that it is extremely generative of progress, of innovation. It can confer legitimacy. It offers a deeper sense of ownership for the people that are involved, a deeper sense of responsibility, more willingness to share resources if you feel like your voice is heard. It empowers the affected communities because they feel like they are heard. But on the other hand, we see that divergent views can be inhibitive of progress. So it can stall or make an initiative lose its momentum. It can actually hinder novelty generation, which is extremely important with grand challenges. It can definitely simplify goals. because you're trying to incorporate so many people. So you make the scope of your response more ambiguous. And it can even lead to a dissolution of initiatives because people feel like it's going nowhere. So really there's a puzzle in terms of understanding when and how managing different views are actually generative or inhibitive of progress on Grand Challenge. And this is what we want to dive into with this paper. So our research question is how multiple actors incorporate their divergent views of a Grand Challenge into their collaborative response to the Grand Challenge. And with what implications for their ability to mitigate the Grand Challenge. So we're not necessarily only focusing on how they do it, but also what is the outcome of this process in terms of progress. So our case study is, for some of you might have seen this a couple of times already because I've been working on this for a while, but our case study is based in Queensland, so in the Great Barrier Reef region. We focus on a cross-sector partnership that was developed in 2008 following a massive flood in the region. And what occurred is that some of the mining pits in the region got completely flooded. So the picture that you see here is one of the largest mining pit in the region, and it's completely flooded. You see the mechanics there, but it's completely, it's supposed to be very, very deep, just to give you an idea. And what happened is that those mining companies had to discharge coal mine wastewater in order to remain functional. And so hundreds of gigaliters of coal mine wastewater was discharged following that flood. And that triggered serious concerns, both for humans and non-humans in the region. So the government decided to launch an independent study to try to understand what was the impact of this discharge, and is it really dangerous for humans and non-humans to do these kinds of discharge when there's flash floods like this in the region. And the consultant that wrote that paper came to the conclusion that it was actually impossible to assess the impact of that flood for the region, because there was really a lack of knowledge on the cumulative impact of all these mines. So the government requires the mines to monitor water quality on their site, but there's no sharing of that data across the region. So it was really, really difficult for them to understand that. So in 2012, a multi-sector collaboration was formed, and it involves industry organizations. So we're talking about coal mining companies, coal power stations, coal seam gas companies, agriculture, so grazers and croppers. We also have academics, scientific people that were involved, and also nonprofits in the region. And so they tried to develop together a better understanding of water quality in the region, so that they could inform decision to improve water quality in the region, so that we could finally have a better understanding, but also better action on the ground. We conducted participant observation, an intensive period of co-location, interviews, and collected documents on the partnership to try to really understand those processes and how they unfolded. So what we came up with are 3 cycles of managing those interpretive tensions. So what we call, the divergent views is really interpretations of the Grand Challenge. And what we see is that whenever there's a manifestation of the Grand Challenge that is worsening, those trigger interpretive tensions for the group, because they put into question their understanding of the Grand Challenge, and they also put in question the response that they have formulated. Is it good enough? Is it not good enough? And so we've seen different cycles that were triggered by environmental events. So really events that are very catastrophic and showing that there is water health degradation in the region, or at least it's signaling it to a lot of stakeholders. And so the partnership is kind of getting an electroshock, and they need to figure out how to deal with these interpretive tensions, because otherwise they would stall, or at least that's their understanding. And so they use a whole bunch of practices to try to mitigate those tensions, to negotiate or work through those tensions. And usually those practices end up informing the way the output or the response is used by the partnership. So what I call an output is the organizational response that is formulated by a group, a collaborative effort to try to tackle a Grand Challenge. In this case, what was developed was a report card. So it was a a sort of cumulative evaluation of water health in the region, where a grade was given to the basin in terms of water quality. So that's kind of the output that they've been working on since 2008. So what we see are different practices, and don't worry, I won't get into all the details, but just to give you an idea, we have advising practices that were used. So actors that, they don't necessarily want to create any turmoil, but they're really trying to provide information and advise the group about what should be done about the grand challenge and about the response. So how can we mitigate those interpretive tensions so that we can move forward? And these can be overt or covert advising. So the quote that I have here is actually from a mining representative that literally just gave a CD to the former chair with all the information about water quality on his site, saying like, do whatever you want with this, but this is information you need to know. It might not get out there, but you need to understand what's going on. So those kinds of advising were used by people that were concerned about those events and really wanted to make a change. You have also broadening practices. So those are the practices that were aimed at mitigating those tensions, again, by altering the output, which typically involved actually adding new components. So it was very rarely about taking something out, but more like, oh, can we talk about this? We need more data on this. We need more data on that. So that was broadening, trying to really stretch the scope of what the output can do. And then containing was the opposite. So those were the actions that were aimed at, again, mitigating those interpretive tension, but actually by delimiting the broadening attempts. So really like, yes, we understand we need to do this, but let's bring this back to validating the output that we have. We have a good product. Let's focus on this. We don't have enough resources to go there, so let's not go there. So much more of a pragmatic, practical approach to tackling those interpretive tensions. However, what we found is that by negotiating and working through those tensions, by using those practices, the partnership actually managed to really tone down those tensions year after year. And on paper, this is a highly successful partnership. It's been long lasting. The partners have been involved for a long time. It's recognized in the region. But we also saw that there are some unintended consequences, like many of you have highlighted in your papers, of mobilizing those practices to try to mitigate interpretive tensions. And we've seen these as cumulative. So in cycle one, we see that a knowledge trap emerged. So where partners really struggled to share, exchange, and combine knowledge on the grand challenge as the result of their management of the interpretive tension. So you see that there is, I guess, a pressure, a tension where people are trying to give them information and they're resisting it. They're not really feeling like they want to incorporate that information in their processes. And then this is followed by an advocacy trap in cycle two, where we see that the partners become overwhelmingly committed and proud of their output, of their report card. So there's a growing commitment to output validation, which is completely normal when you think about it. There's a big problem and you have a solution and you've promoted it and it seems to be resonating with stakeholders. So you want to keep committing to it. But it also actually impeded water health focused activities. So you had those little voices in the partnership saying like, hey guys, we're not really fully understanding water health. These are just a couple of indicators. We would need to broaden, again, the scope of the output. But everybody's like, nah, listen, we've got a good product. And to the point where people resisted trying to understand their role in water health degradation. So the quote that I have here is from a scientist in a meeting where she was saying that, the mining companies have an impact on the reef, on the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the partners just said, no, it cannot be us that is involved or that is a contributor to water health degradation. The report card cannot say this. If we're having a good product, it's not going there, let's not bring it there. But it is a facet of the grand challenge that is not being covered because we're so devoted to focusing on the output as it is. And then as we move further along through the years, in the language that is used and the way that they talk about the issue, we see that the practices become repetitive. People become compliant, or the language that is used to talk about the grand challenge becomes homogenized. It becomes more rigid, and we see that it is actually stifling innovation. And this is one of the Secretariat's employees saying, the risk profile is low, people are very happy with the product, but it's stifling innovation. Innovation is gone. So there's really a lack of reflexivity. We're really moving away from being extremely in tune with what is going on, and we're more focusing on promoting what we have, if you will.
2 minutes, Fannie.
Yep. And so what we have, if I can position my model more in a processual matter, is we have those triggers, environmental triggers that lead to interpretive tension for the group, the different practices that are used to try to shape the output so that it can address those triggers. But we also see those traps that keep accumulating across the years. And what we see is that there's this kind of V-shaped thing. And this is Paula's contribution to our paper. I remember her doing this to me, but there's a V-shape going on in your process story. There's an escalating commitment to validating the output on the one hand, and there's a decreasing ability to address the grand challenge on the other. And this gap is widening as we see those traps accumulating over the years. So what we see is an output-outcome decoupling. So really a disconnection between the output that is produced and the outcome that it generates. So we believe that this paper, it can contribute to explaining organizational processes and practices leading to failure to address grand challenges, and more specifically, the micro-foundation of responding to grand challenges. So really the social mechanisms that are shaping progress on grand challenge. The role of divergent views. So we're actually reconciling that tension that I mentioned earlier. So why is it both generative and inhibitive? We're showing that, yes, it is generative in terms of mobilization, of success, in terms of representativity and stakeholder resonance, but on the other hand, it's inhibitive of progress, tackling progress on the grand challenge, sorry. And finally, our paper also revealed that the practices triggering the reinforcing and cumulative traps are widening the gap between output and outcome. So we're not only looking at the internal organizational processes of tackling a grand challenge, but we're really trying to link that to the response that is formulated and the outcome. So we're trying to have a more all-encompassing understanding of this issue. So that's me done. I hope this was clear, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. Thank you. Gary, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Apologies. Great. I was just saying great. Thank you. So Marius, you've got a question. Would you like to start?
I was actually clapping or trying to clap for a brilliant presentation. I think this is super fascinating, and this divergent views and how it seems that some sort of voices are somehow silenced. That's sort of something that seems very interesting to me, and I just congratulations with very interesting and a cool paper.
Okay. Any of the other authors, Krista?
Yes, sorry, I have a question.
Please.
Yeah, actually, what I found was really interesting was this notion of the focus on the output versus the outcome. And I wonder if, to boost that contribution, if there's something in boundary work, if we think about a boundary object as helpful, right? Kind of the over inclination is boundary objects help us move things forward, they help store information, but it almost seems like you have the opposite story. By focusing on the report card, they're losing focus on the outcome. So it's almost kind of the dark side of boundary objects, because you already have that is one of your findings, and if there's a way to kind of boost that finding, I thought it would be interesting, again, not suggesting other literature, but to actually kind of amplify that. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thanks a lot, Krista, and thank you for being here. Yes, I will definitely. Well, we've been toying with boundary literature, boundary organization also is a thing. So because those are cross-sector partnerships, you can see that they are also in that they're representing a boundary organization, if you will. So yeah, there's definitely different framings that we can toy around with, and this could be a good way forward. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a question very shortly, and you might have said it and I might have missed it, but I'm just wondering a little bit throughout your model, in the 3 stages that you described, do you also look at the differences in the triggers, or do you say that the triggers are somewhat constant in terms of the grand challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Madalina. No, we actually, in our findings, we have a whole section, a 1-pager per cycle, where we describe what exactly is the trigger and why do we as authors consider it a trigger, because obviously there's many triggers in grand challenges that can be triggers for many different stakeholders, right? So for a conservation group, a trigger could be, oh, we've lost a turtle species, but it's not really resonating with the partnership. So we did not include that as a trigger, because what we focused on was what was considered as a trigger by the partnership members. So it was flagged by them like, oh, there's a fish kill. There's actually thousands of fish that are floating in the river. That's a concern to us. We need to do something about it. So that's when we integrated it as a trigger. And what we saw was these moments where it seemed to be a whole package, you know, so you had a fish kill, you had a gold mine that got flooded, and then there was toxic waste going down the river. The river was, very, very flashy green. Yeah. So you had almost this grocery list in the meeting minutes. And when I talked with them, it was very clear that these were demarcations in their understanding of the grand challenge, because it created those tensions. And in the second part of our findings, we really explain what we mean by those tensions, how did they manifest, and why were they, was there a need for them to mitigate them, to address them? Yeah. But yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
And I also want to say, like, I've seeing how the paper has evolved. I think this is super nice in terms of and much more clear, I think, in terms of the way.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I mean, we're almost up for the next presentation to 11:22, but I just want to say, I mean, I read this paper, I reviewed it actually, and it has changed a lot, and I think it's fascinating. I still wonder about the role of materiality and the role that's playing. The report card seems so central as an actor in this, right? That it reminds me a lot of Paula's paper with Paul Spee, right, on the planning process, how the plan gains authority and restricts things. And it just seems like when I look at the model, I looked at the original model and the model you presented, it's fascinating, but I still would like to see personally more of the material working in there as part of this relationship. But it's a fascinating paper, and I'm sure it will come up at the end when we have a general conversation. Thank you so much, Fannie. If we could move on to the next presenter, Marius, please share your screen. We'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Is it in slide mode as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Marius Andersson. I'm a PhD candidate at the BI Norwegian Business School. And very briefly stated, in this paper, I conduct an in-depth critical reading of a specific strategy document represented as an industry-level strategic plan that articulates an imagined future for an entire industry. In doing so, I direct attention to strategic plans developed and disseminated outside the boundaries of individual organizations as a focal phenomenon deserving more attention. In particular, I propose that studying such documents may help advance our understanding of the discursive and textual underpinnings of future constructions. So moving on to how I motivate this study and a little bit about its link to established and emerging streams of literature. We might say that conceptions of the future have in some ways always been fundamental to organization and strategic management literature. However, it is only more recently that a specific need for closer empirical investigations into various kinds of future-making practices have been recognized and articulated, as in the recent paper by Wenzel and colleagues. In line with this view, the future is no longer understood as some kind of objective thing that can be more or less accurately captured or predicted. Instead, this perspective allows for recognizing the future as an inherently unknowable or open-ended temporal category that is essentially produced and enacted through future-making practices. For example, Jane has in one of her exemplary studies shown that constructions of the future shape how organizations respond to grand challenges. Accordingly, it becomes of key importance to develop more in-depth understandings of the various artifacts, tools, and discursive practices employed in efforts underpinning future constructions. Of course, there is one artifact in particular that is commonly used to articulate imagined futures, namely the strategic plan. While a substantial stream of research focusing on strategic plans has helped advance our understanding of strategy as a genre, illuminated its often future-oriented language, and firmly demonstrated the force potential of strategy texts, as well as the need for critical analysis of the microtextual elements of such documents, there is still a need for more work to better understand the role of individual strategy texts, as recently pointed out by Vara. In particular, as extant studies have tended to focus on future constructions and strategic plans within various types of organizations, less attention has been given to such documents occurring in extra-organizational domains or at the industry level. I argue that these are unfortunate oversights. First, to the extent that strategy discourse is indeed increasingly employed in extra-organizational domains, it is important that scholars concerned with understanding the role of strategic plans also begin to investigate more closely the apparently prevalent phenomenon of extra-organizational strategy documents or industry-level strategic plans, and to consider how such documents become established as strategic. Secondly, given that organizations seem to be increasingly confronted with and engaged in addressing various multi-scale issues that extend far beyond the boundaries of individual organizations, and recognizing that such multi-scale issues like climate change and digital transformation are indeed making the inherent open-endedness of the future particularly pronounced, as pointed out by Wenzel et al., it seems clear that we also need to consider more closely future-making practices in extra-organizational domains or at the field level. By analyzing a specific instance of a salient document represented as an industry-level strategic plan that articulates an imagined future for an entire industry, I attempt with this paper to begin to address this paucity. Just to say a few more words on the theoretical background of the paper, while trying not to repeat myself. This paper linked with a broader stream of literature, taking a discursive perspective on strategy as an alternative to what may be termed rationalist approaches to strategy. A discursive perspective allows for seeing strategy not as some objective attribute of organizations, but instead as a linguistic construction. Of course, many of the studies investigating discursive aspects of strategy also have a natural affinity with the strategy as practice literature more broadly, as they have helped elucidate various discursive practices involved in strategy work, as well as how dominant conceptions of strategy shape how it is enacted within organizations. In this study, I draw on the CDA framework developed by Fair Club because it is particularly helpful for aiding me in conducting a critical, in-depth reading of a carefully selected text. It is against this backdrop that I engage with and attempt to contribute within the intersection of the streams of research concerned with strategic plans and future constructions, as I have already explained. So turning to the empirical case, the specific document that I rely on for illuminating how an industry-wide future may be constructed within an industry-level strategy text is entitled Construction 2025. This publicly available document was produced and disseminated by the UK government in 2013. The document was produced in collaboration with various stakeholders within the UK construction industry context and adheres to many of the generic characteristics of a strategic plan. The document entails an overarching concern with major issues such as digitalization, which continues to be a salient topic within the UK construction industry, and is also consistent with the grand discourse within the construction industry more widely conceived. A notable feature of this industry is also that it is characterized by what is often referred to as an extreme fragmentation between stakeholders, arguably making it a particularly fruitful context for illuminating some of the paradoxes involved in efforts to construct a collective industry-wide future. Moreover, I argue that this document is particularly appropriate for serving as a revelatory case for the purposes of this study, partly because its explicit labeling as a strategy for the entire UK construction industry makes it a clear instance of the contemporary phenomenon of industry-level strategic plans. Also, the fact that the document was created in partnership between government and prominent industry actors and disseminated through official government channels makes it a highly salient document that can reasonably be seen as a form of authoritative text. Finally, for purposes of transparency, a noteworthy advantage of relying on this specific document is that it is publicly and permanently available from the UK government's website, allowing other readers the opportunity to challenge, corroborate, or extend the in-depth reading proffered in this paper. So as already mentioned, I employ a CDA approach in order to unpack the document because CDA is well suited for aiding in the close reading of a single text. I followed recommended procedures for conducting CDA analysis as I engaged in repeated and increasingly more targeted in-depth readings of the focal document, as well as moving back and forth between consulting theoretical resources and scrutinizing the empirical material. So overall, I identified within the focal document 4 key discursive moves that worked to construe the document's strategic status, establish its authority, and develop a sense of responsibility related to strategy realization, represent the industry as an entity with a capacity for collective action, and construct a vision for the future of the industry. I propose that the first 3 may be usefully conceived of as discursive building blocks that facilitate for accomplishing the 4th, and I elucidate their textual underpinnings within the document. To give you a little bit of a sense of the textual underpinnings of the 4 key discursive moves, consider these illustrative excerpts from the document. One simple but notable point about these examples underpinning the first move is that they illustrate a self-referential practice throughout the document that works not only to remind readers of the document's special status, but ultimately also to construct the strategy it articulates as an object with its own existence. Through such formulations, the articulated strategy takes on an objective and independent existence, which is what allows it to have ambitions and make commitments. One notable point about the excerpt illustrating the underpinning of the second move is the represented percolating nature of responsibility, which within the document serves to render somewhat opaque where or with whom responsibility resides. Just to mention a few more points about the findings that could hopefully be interesting to contemplate further. First, consider in concert the textual devices at work within the document seem to testify to the inherent flexibility of strategy discourse. In particular, they seem to involve a kind of stretching of well-established strategy concepts and genre conventions by extending them to apply at the industry level. Consider, for instance, the document's representation of the industry as an entity. This was essentially achieved through a clear delineation of an outside and the construction of a grand collective. As such, the document adheres to what the strategy genre seems to unavoidably demand, namely a representation of some sort of unit or collective for realizing strategy. Of course, while there might be painstaking efforts involved in attempts at constructing a sense of collective we within an organization, this is arguably complicated manifold at the industry level. at least within the strategy document analyzed in this paper, the fragile nature of the constructed collective was especially striking as a consequence of the paradoxical tension between the industry being represented as extremely fragmented, yet addressed as an entity. Accordingly, the practice of stretching strategy discourse seems to imply a demand for constructing even the most fragile of collectives. This finding could be especially relevant for actors engaged in the discursive practice of stretching strategy as a body of knowledge to be employed in extra-organizational domains, such as in efforts of facilitating concerted efforts at the industry level or in addressing meta-problems and grand challenges. Relatedly, the construction of more or less fragile collectives may serve a key role in discursive future-making practices taking place beyond individual organizations more generally. Finally, it seems particularly interesting to note the percolating nature of responsibility represented within the text. This, in a sense, seems to imply that everyone, as well as no one in particular, are responsible for the realization of the imagined future of the industry, while being mindful not to draw too wide-ranging conclusions based on the analysis of a single industry-level strategy document. It seems reasonable to suggest that the percolating nature of responsibility constructed within the document might not be a peculiar characteristic of this specific text, but instead be rather likely to be found in contexts of extra-organizational future-making efforts more generally and in discursive attempts to articulate industry-level strategies in particular. So in conclusion, I propose that this study stands to make a few contributions, perhaps most notably by directing attention to industry-level strategy documents as a contemporary phenomenon deserving more scrutiny from strategy discourse scholars, and by beginning to unpack in detail how constructions of the future may be crafted at the textual level. The paper can hopefully help advance an emerging theme of research concerned with detail-sensitive investigations of various kinds of future-making practices. So thank you very much. That's it from me.
Great, thank you very much, Marius. Could I ask questions? Anyone from any co-authors or co-presenters? Any questions? Fannie?
Yeah, thanks, Marius. That was really a really nice read. It was really nicely written. So I was just about to just read the intro to be able to have a conversation. I was like, wow, this is great. And I ended up reading the whole thing. But one thing I was curious about, so you say you use critical discourse analysis, and I was wondering, this is a government-produced paper on a construction industry, if I understand correctly. So there's a little bit of a power thing there, in my understanding, because it feels like it's, you know, it's mommy telling its industry, guys, get it together. We need to figure out what's going on. And this is the imagined future that we would like you guys to go into. And I thought that this was an interesting tension in the text, and using critical discourse analysis to unpack that could be interesting. Or have you investigated that aspect or that angle of the paper?
Thank you very much for such kind comments, Fannie, and also interesting point. And just to be a little bit more clear about it, was not the government sort of on their own, but in partnership with the industry actors. So there is this sort of collaborative efforts in producing the document. But absolutely, I think I also sort of use that as this power imbalance, or that the fact that this seems to be a clear instance of authoritative text sort of also stems from this. It is in fact the government that disseminates it, and so I sort of, for now, I'm sort of been saying that, well, that makes critical discourse analysis absolutely or that type of documents sort of, they call for critical scrutiny. So that's sort of one reason to to select this specific document and not some kind of other sort of similar document. So I sort of, but yeah, as I only look at what happens within the text itself, I cannot really explore so much about what the dynamics that went into producing the text, but the fact that it was produced and disseminated by the government, yeah, it sort of calls for this type of critical reading, I think. So I don't know if that was sort of a response to your question, but
yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Madalina?
Yeah, so I'll hit with 2 questions, and then you can take whichever you want as answering or not even at all, and you just take it, move forward. But one element that I was thinking is, first of all, the tension and connections that I found a little bit lacking in exploring between the document setting itself as a strategic text and the connection to that with the other part of of what you're actually investigated, which is designing an actual future for the industry. So I think one of the when I was reading the introduction, I was really excited to find more about that. But in the findings, I think it could be explored a little bit more, the interconnections between these 2 sides of the documents, if you want to look at it as such. And the second one is, I was wondering, because you do say that, well, it's setting itself as strategic and all that, and I know that it might be going a little bit over the critical discourse analysis that you want to do, but have you ever considered of actually looking at if this is actually taken on by the rest of the actors in their own discourses, maybe it doesn't have to be in interviews or anything like that, but at least on their websites, on in media or something like that, where you can still continue the critical discourse analysis, but still connect it with, well, this is, they themselves see it as strategic, or this particular future view of the industry is completely out, for example, right? But these were my 2 knocks at it.
We're sort of a bit tight on time, so Marius, perhaps I could just ask you to sort of absorb those comments. I had a similar feeling, actually, the idea that, maybe, I know it's not in the data, but it'd be quite interesting to look at the consumption side of this, right? So you've got the discursive practices and these different textual characteristics. How are they consumed, and what do they actually do for grand challenges? But in the interest of time, I think we'll need to move on, and maybe in the general discussion we could pick that back up. Thanks so much. So Kenneth, Daniel and Gerard, I think it's Kenneth who's presenting. Could I ask you to share screen and present your paper, please?
Yes, here it is. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, so very good evening to everyone. It's evening on my side here. So I'm presenting a paper about legitimating practices and challenges. And this is about how nascent organizations or newcomers overcome unfavorable legitimacy judgments to form partnerships with incumbents. So this is joint work with my co-authors, Daniel Mack at SMU and Jerry George as well at Georgetown University. So, I just want to start with this recognition that collaborations are difficult. Like, we know that they're important, but how do we collaborate? That's always the bigger challenge. And so in the context of a grand challenge, we know that these collaborative partnerships are key in addressing grand challenges. There's a potential to harness these combined ideas, capabilities, and resources. But specifically, we are interested in how nascent organizations can partner with incumbents in the context of addressing grand challenges. And the reason for why is because a lot of these newcomers can be a source of innovation. But in order for them to enter the ecosystem to address some of these challenges, they usually have to partner with larger incumbent organizations such as government entities. These entities are likely to have influence over regulation. And the other characteristic of this setting is that it's important to maintain continuity because beneficial stakeholders may come from vulnerable populations. So, we can't innovate through disruption. And so this led us to identifying what we are calling the value preservation paradox. So what is this value preservation paradox? It's we start once again from newcomers being able to introduce or to create innovations within the ecosystem with new practices that break from existing ways of doing things. However, these partnerships are hindered by a plurality of goals, values, and structure, right? It's really hard for newcomers to come in and be able to work with incumbent organizations. So on one hand, they're trying to do something new, but on the other hand, these newcomers face pressures to conform to existing practices to gain legitimacy by partners. And the irony is that conformity may reduce the innovativeness of their work and undermine the value of their contributions. So the research question that we are trying to address here is how can newcomers with these new innovations overcome the value preservation paradox to partner with incumbents. So we studied this in the context of online platforms for crowd-funded donations in the social service sector in an Asian country. The incumbent organizations in this setting are the public social welfare agencies, right? So these are agencies that are government funded, right? And the new entrants are these privately funded online platforms for crowd-funded donations. So, imagine you have someone with some sort of a financial need, and this person would then go onto these platforms to try to raise money, right? A little bit more about what these platforms do and what the social welfare sector does in this setting. So the incumbent organizations provide direct and indirect financial assistance, counseling, and home care for poorer resource individuals. These agencies, the focal agencies that we are looking at are called the family service agencies, and they provide support for those with marital, parenting, employment, and financial needs. And so these new entrants are the privately funded online platforms for crowd-funded donations. And these platforms allow any individual or organization to put up campaigns to appeal to potential donors for funds. And the thing to note that on both, what's interesting is that I know that in some countries, you can have individuals basically going on to these platforms by themselves. But in this setting, we actually have case workers, so hired by the platforms. So these case workers are employed by the platforms to help some of these vulnerable, to help their clients. They call them clients, but to help the clients get onto this platform, to put their cases up on these platforms. So in some ways, we noticed that we thought that they were working in a way that was very similar to the social workers in the public social sector, right? Now, the impetus for this, the kind of what got us curious in the first place was that, we noticed that these crowdfunding platforms provided a very nice complementary service to the existing social net. So you have government policies and government handouts, right? Government financial assistance schemes. but you'll always have individuals who fall through the cracks for whatever reasons, right? And so this is where crowdfunding comes into the picture, right? And so our initial thinking about crowdfunding was that this is something that perfectly fits or complements the social system, right? It adds value to the ecosystem. And because of that, it should be something that will be welcomed with open arms by incumbents, because, hey, we're all there to help the poor. But what's interesting is that as we spoke to people on the ground, some of the incumbents, we got a very negative response. And this was echoed by our informants as well. And so a member of parliament who was approached said that, there's nothing that crowdfunding can do for my constituents. A medical social worker said that her hospital does not want to have anything to do with crowdfunding. And another social worker has said, was reported to say that crowdfunding is a short-term band-aid that does not address the root causes of the client's dependency on the public welfare assistance. Right? And so you're starting to see some of this resistance towards crowd-funded donations, which we found very peculiar. But what was interesting is that over time, well, here's another quote. Oh, sorry, I realized I was a little behind on the examples. But here's another quote, right, from one of the caseworkers on the platform who recounted how the social workers responded to her. Well, what we noticed that over time, crowd-funded donations began to become more readily accepted by the incumbents. So, one of our informants from the social sector said that, this could be a way for welfare needs to be met through community support, or as a way to identify individuals in need and bring them into the welfare system. When we caught up with one of the crowdfunding platforms just this year alone, it was reported that we work with all the SSAs. These are the social service agencies, and we've had 46 cases referred by 15 partners. When we looked at media reports of the, in terms of the tone of these towards crowdfunding, we see that there was a dip between 2015 or so, and there's a gradual improvement in people's attitudes towards crowdfunding. So our data source was based on ethnographic observations, interviews with key personnel, and archival information as well. We wanted to compare because we wanted to compare the routines of social workers and those of case workers on the crowdfunding platform. And the reason was because they seem to play very similar roles, but in some ways they were doing very different things. And so we were just very curious about how they were able to gain acceptance from a practice perspective. We conducted a comparative analysis of these practices and iterated between the literature and data to identify emergent categories of practices and their relationships to the phenomena of partnering. Now, so in terms of our findings, one of the practices to overcome this value preservation paradox that allowed newcomers to partner with incumbents. We identified two types of practices. These were practices that were differentiated from incumbents, and yeah, I see your message, Gary, and practices that were duplicated or similar to those enacted by incumbents. And these practices, by the way, are those enacted by caseworkers on the crowdfunding platforms. So I'll share with you the first type of practice, which is, we're calling it practices that enacted a value complementarity. And what this practices essentially is about is that it's, they're doing different things, okay? But they both enhance the value towards, but they're both value enhancing, right? In terms of assisting clients to improve their outcomes. So how are they different, right? So in social work, social workers tend to compartmentalize the client's circumstances to identify interventions and disentangle some of the presenting and underlying issues. Whereas in the crowdfunding, in the crowdfunding context, the caseworkers would tend to contextualize these circumstances to justify the client's request to donors. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the examples, but I do want to show you the other practices, or at least what the practices do. And so these practices around that were enacted to complement the value of incumbents' work led to perceptions of goal congruity, and the other differentiated practices were practices that were different but upheld professional values, and that led to an alignment of perceptions of value congruity. In terms of the duplicated practices, these were practices that were related to the adoption of best practices in governance, and this led to perceptions of structural congruity. I'm going to jump quickly to the contributions now, and I think what we have here is a way to introduce this value preservation paradox, which arises from the plurality of goals, values, and structure faced by new organizations in forming partnerships with incumbents to address grand challenges. And it's really about this pressure to differentiate and duplicate that the newcomers face when operating in this context. This practice perspective of how newcomers can overcome the VPP to foster partnerships with incumbents contrasts and complements existing approaches for gaining legitimacy that have largely been focused on impression management or competition. So we're bringing in the practice perspective to that, and it's also a different model of innovation that doesn't rely on disruption, but really looks at how the practice of collaboration can contribute to innovations in grand challenges. So I'm going to end off here, but I'll show the slide with our model here. So in case people have questions, we can easily refer to that. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. Could I invite anybody to ask a question or make a comment, please? Yeah, Fannie, please.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. I actually did my master's thesis on the role of crowdfunding as a funding strategy for nonprofits. So I found that super interesting. Yeah. And one of the questions I had, and it's linked to the findings that I found, and it's an entirely different context, but I saw that the organizations were using crowdfunding for different purposes. So for instance, some of them were funding an entirely new center. Like we want to build a new center, so let's get like millions of dollars of crowdfunding to get into that. So I mean, the scope of the project was much larger than, we want to fund an outdoor activity for teenagers this summer. So there was this large array of usage of crowdfunding that was done by social workers. I would suspect that depending on the scope, it would trigger different kinds of paradoxes or different kinds of tensions with the field in general. So that was my first question. Are there any, do you differentiate in terms of the different campaigns that you're looking at? The second question I have is you mentioned a lot incumbents and challengers, and this sounds to me like Neil Flickstein's jargon of organizational field dynamics. Like are we talking about a strategic action field, and how is legitimacy, how incumbents, challengers carve their legitimacy claims in an organizational field, and I think that could be positioned a bit more sharply in your front end. Okay. Like the sort of, because you're looking very specifically on the crowdfunding platform, but this is, this is really trying to shape the way institutional change is done at the field level in terms of how we approach beneficiaries, how do we try to service them. So, but yeah, very fascinating paper. So those were my 2 questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Fannie.
Kenneth, I mean, would you rather maybe open it up and ask get some more questions and comments so you can take them on board?
Yes.
Has anybody else got any comments or questions that to raise? Okay, I mean, I had one. I read this. This was fascinating to me as well. I really enjoyed the paper because I've done a lot of work on public-private partnerships and the tensions between them, right, cross-sector. And so I suppose one of the questions for me, well, there was 2, but I'll just ask one, was around, if you think about the boundary conditions and the theoretical generalizability of this, would these kind of legitimating practices work in other contexts, especially cross-sector contexts, for example? Because obviously, there's a more sort of fundamental kind of value incongruence there. There's sort of a lot more tension. They're almost fundamentally opposite. So could some of these things work in that context? And just another comment was around the role of identity, because you're sort of saying that they have to replicate the identity of the incumbents to a degree and enact their practices. And I wonder in some contexts, and this is more think about future directions of research, but in some contexts, if you start to do that, by replicating those practices, you as an organization could actually change, right? By starting to engage in more social practices, for example, a business could become more social in its orientation. So I suppose those are more kind of boundary conditions, future directions, but I think the paper itself was great.
Thanks, Gary. I'll just quickly say that your last point, just on your last point, is we're kind of actually weaving it into the paper because so we're not seeing that as future research, but that is, I think, pretty critical in this setting. That's what makes that's part of the whole paradox.
Yeah.
So thanks. I'm glad you saw that too.
Great, thank you so much, Kenneth. Really interesting paper. So last but not least, could I ask Madalina to present their paper on grand challenges and their literature review?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get this running and hopefully I'll be able to share my screen. Can you see this?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so just as Fannie was saying that their paper has changed a lot, our paper has been changing quite a bunch as well since we uploaded first to AOM, and this you can see very easily in the title. So while initially we focused we had no focus, we said we will be doing a review of the Grand Challenge literature. Well, now we are focusing on the relationship between agency and grand challenges. So we have the title Agency and Grand Challenges, a Conceptual Framework, Review, and Future Research Agenda. And of course, I won't go into what grand challenges are. I think the crowd already knows and is very familiar with the concept. But again, so very complex, large problems. And the idea is that especially organizational scholars have been increasingly, and management scholars, of course, has been increasingly been interested in the concept. With a lot of papers coming up, at least, especially in the last 6-7 years, with the boom around this topic, which also led to somewhat of a fragmentation in literature with different style of conceptualizations of the grand challenge, of what grand challenges are, different ontologies of the grand challenge, and so on. And one of the key concerns actually is the role of agency. This is what we found out, is that on the one hand, you see some literature looking at organizations in themselves having the agency of what are the choices for them to actually tackle with the grand challenges, right? It's about organizations doing something towards solving grand challenges, but also organizations being responsible for grand challenges arising, right? So highly agentic. On the other hand, we see other research looking at grand challenges that impact organizations, impact entire populations, and even strip away agency from actors. So what we said with, okay, let's look at the literature from an agency perspective and review the agentic relationship between organizations and grant challenges. And we looked a little bit at the foundations, and we found out that there's two distinct ways of conceptualizing the grant challenge. Some of them look at it from a science, what we call a science perspective, which is mostly drawing from Hilbert's mathematics view, right, where they see grant challenges as a clearly articulated goal. It has to be clear, easily, well, it can be difficult, but it is solvable. It is constructed by actors, so it's people that really set the goal for others to go for it, or even themselves, right? So it has a high likelihood of success in dealing with the challenge. It's just a gap that you need to overcome. On the other hand, you have what we say a policy perspective, which is basically articles that draw from a policy a foundation, especially from wicked problems, where they see grant challenges as not even solvable at all in most cases, right? It's wicked problems, it's a systemic issue where you need a lot of actors, but even those actors, it's difficult to see if they actually can solve the challenge, and you have a lot of dynamics going back and forth and multiple unintended consequences that lead to maybe grant challenges, actors not being able to do anything about them in themselves. So yes, this is we did a systematic literature review, and we focused, especially if you look at our last paper here, we really focused on grant challenges as a term. This is because we also found out that, for example, if you look at when you look at the conceptualizations, looking at, for example, wicked problems, if you start adding wicked problems and meta problems and other styles of concepts into it, some of them are even conceptualized as opposing grant challenges. So in some literature, they say that wicked problems is completely opposed to grant challenges, which is surprising. So we said, okay, let's just look at grant challenges and see what management actually says about them themselves, right? And we drilled down through the literature, and we were set with 120 articles that were somewhat set up like this. So you can see again the very high interest, especially in the last years towards grant challenges, but also we found that it's the distribution between articles. It's so if you look at FT50 versus non-FT50, it's somewhat of a third. So a third of the articles are highly top-notch journal style articles. Good. So this is our conceptual framework, which is again highly different from what we had beforehand. But we said, okay, so we're going to look at the agency and the relationship between the agency of organizations and grant challenges in a 2x2 matrix. And first of all, from an ontological perspective, we find that you have two different ways of conceptualizing the ontology. You either have a clearly dualist perspective, where you have organizations completely different from grant challenges, right? The grant challenges are out there in the world, while we as organizations are out here. And at best, you have organizations going for a grant challenge that is different from them as an objective, for example, to tackle them, right? On the other hand of the spectrum, you have a duality ontology, where you have organizations and grant challenges highly intertwined, so intertwined that you can't really distinguish them, right? The whole idea of organizations causing grant challenges and at the same time them themselves being affected by grant challenges, these are completely different ways of conceptualizing the relationship, right? So, and where the two cannot be distincted in any way or form. So that's on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, you have the locus of agency. So basically, where does action stem from? In that sense, we see some papers looking at especially an organizational locus of agency, where especially organizations act towards grant challenges. Organizations do something towards grant challenges, while on the other hand of the spectrum, we have a grant challenge locus of agency, where grand challenges do most of the action, right? Grand challenges affect organizations, grand challenges affect populations, and so on. So according to these two axes, we have the four different ways of conceptualizing the relationship. First of all, a strategic perspective. And this is basically looking at, it's research that actually says, okay, so organizations are acting and the relationship between the organization and the grand challenge is distinct, and especially it is especially research looking at, for example, strategies and innovations and tools to tackle the grand challenge. Furthermore, we have a contingency perspective, what we call contingency perspective, of course, which is basically the idea of organizations being affected by grand challenges, right? Organizations and populations in themselves, at best, having the possibility of adapting their strategies and adapting themselves to the hegemonic force of a grand challenge. On a duality side, here we have the robust action perspective, which is especially literature that draws, for example, on Ferraro's seminal paper from 2015. That's why we call it the robust action perspective, which is, again, the relationship between the two are highly intertwined, right? Organizations and the grand challenges are affecting each other continuously, but especially by, for example, organizations setting up and defining the challenges themselves, right? So, for example, while on the strategic perspective, you have organizations scoping a challenge that is out there, here they're defining the challenge themselves. They're co-empowering each other to act and create the challenge or create action against the challenge. And finally, we have the structuration perspective, which is basically the perspective that organizations are caught within the dynamics between causing the challenge and the challenge especially the challenge actually affecting themselves. So it's they are caught within the forces. They have no agency whatsoever, and whatever agency, it's completely just scattered style of actions and partial strategies that they can enact. But it's mostly that the organizations through the grand challenges, through the unexpected consequences, for the extreme dynamics and paradoxes that the grand challenge entail, create lead the organizations in itself to not be able to do anything but be caught in the actions. And according to these, we looked at future research, and the future research especially is made by looking at the tensions between the different perspectives, but also at the different strands that are not, different topics that are not really tackled by any of the different perspectives. And these are our four main research suggestions. First of all, regarding scaling, well, I think we find that there's not enough research that actually looks at what is the agentic potentialities of organizations as the scale of the grand challenges differs. Right. So on the one hand, we have different grand challenges that have different scales in themselves. Right. So then there's need for more research that looks at the difference, how the agency differs of the organizations as different as grand challenges are different in scale. But also we need to look much more into the dynamics of the scaling. So how does the action potentialities of organization change as the grand challenges change in scale, as we know from literature beforehand? And furthermore, we also need to know how the actions of organizations may lead to differences in scale and changes in scale of the grand challenge. There's also more research needed on action initiation. So this is especially finding out, okay, where does action come from initially, but also what are the actual everyday practices of dealing with the grand challenges? How do people in themselves deal with and are affected by the grand challenges? And especially there's very, very little research that actually looks at the intentional action of organizations against dealing with the grand challenges. So the ones that actually block the grand challenge to be solved, right? There's also need for more research when we look at the aggregation. So we know that we have distributed agencies, right? We know that there's a lot of actors needing to act towards tackling grand challenges, and also a lot of actors being caught in the web of creating a grand challenge. But how do you actually create then a responsibility? How do you create legitimacy, as some of the papers deal with in this trend? How do even actions get stabilized then within, for example, an institutional setting? And finally, there's more need to actually understand temporality. I think much more in the grand challenge, not only how do organizations deal with the complex time horizons, but also if you look at the different perspectives that we identify, what are the tensions about regarding between controlling time and constructing, for example, the different time perspectives of the grand challenge. Okay, so that's basically it from us. And I have some open questions. It is, again, very, very changed, but we want to find out especially if the organizational, the organizing framework, so this one, actually speaks to you, and especially around the locus of agency and so on, if you got it, and if you find especially new things that you think are not actually tackled in our perspective. But that's about it.
Great, thank you, Madalina. That's great. It's great to see a systematic review like this, actually. Could I invite questions from anybody on the points just raised? Comments? Yeah, Fannie, did you put your hand up?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Madalina. So this was a really good read and on point, on time for me, because I'm also, like everyone involved in that literature, trying to make sense of the mess, and you've done a good job really highlighting some of the issues. And I think you cited Brammer in there, who did also a review, and he distinguished the two different kinds of trends, one that was more focusing on grand challenges as technical and sexy kind of projects that people gather resources around and are trying to resolve, and on the other hand, more broad brush societal issues that are harder to tackle because they're more fluid and harder to define. And I wondered if you used that also as a lens when you constructed that table. So did you focus specifically on because it seems to me like you're focusing more on the societal aspects, so the grand challenge as more of a, because you listed in your paper, a lot of characteristics that seem to resonate more with that trend. So that was my first question. And the second is, so you mentioned organizational actors, and I assume that you're not necessarily making a difference between the different levels of organizing, because there's cross-sector partnerships, there's firms level, but there's also a field, more institutional response that can be done. So what was how did you treat that kind of level of organizing in your framework?
Thanks, Fannie. Well, these are actually very good questions. So regarding the first question with the societal versus technical challenges, we do take on it a little bit here in the background. So it's here around the science versus the policy level, and policy level goes more towards the societal challenges. But I think most of it is, so we didn't, when we did the search, we said grand asterisk challenge. So we left it open as how the organizations how the papers can actually conceptualize it. And what we found is most of them actually conceptualize it as the societal things. I think we had two options, two versions of it that were not necessarily as such. So just because they were only 2 out of a total of, 200 and something, then it's, we just said, okay, that's not that much. And then on your next question, I think that's super interesting. So So by default, we said organizational from so organization in itself as, for example, a firm or a municipality or so on. But you are right. It's the literature goes all over the place in terms of levels of analysis, and this actually goes especially in terms of is highlighted especially here, I think, where we said that a lot of the strategies is here about partnering and here about collaborative actions with others and here it's collaborative from anywhere like just open strategy style things, interorganizational, but also just collaborative communities working together to deal with it. So we, from that perspective, it's because most of the research is they themselves set as organizations, like firms and so on. We took that perspective, but it comes highly broadened, especially in the robust action and and the structuration perspective that takes a more sometimes community level and field level perspective.
Thank you. Any other reflections or comments? Ferret, yes, Bridget?
Thank you very much, Madalina. Very, very nice presentation. Unfortunately, I couldn't read the paper, so it's just a reflection on what
it's a completely different paper either way, okay. So it would have been worthless.
What struck me, what I was thinking when I saw this graphic with dualism, duality, I was thinking about so dualism, these interventionist approaches very often, just when you think of the SDG goals, there is very often this, now we come in and do something, and then poverty, for example, or climate change, do something, and then it should be better. I was thinking, and duality is more this process-based, I'm coming from a routine dynamics perspective, so more in this actions and more in this ongoing doings. Does that make sense, or do you see some differences there on how to tackle it? So this interventionist versus, and then again, of course, on this process, we have this level discussion. Are we on the individual level, organizational group level stuff?
Exactly. No, so I think that we, so if you take this one out, the lower levels out, so when the grand challenge is actually acting, then you could take a lot of perspective saying that, okay, this is highly interventionist, but it's surprising to see, for example, a lot of research from strategic choice theoretical perspective or resource-based view actually still in here. So, and a lot of articles as such, while here it is articles, yes, that take more a practice and processional view, but it's still, I think the main element it's still a lot of interventionalist style thing. They just take into account the connection is much more connected, let's call it like that, between the challenge and the actors, because you have these loops between the challenge and the acting organizations, and these loops can be reinforcing loops, such as when an organization acts, they are supported by the overall community, and that leads to something happening in the challenge that they themselves afterwards being pushed forward towards acting. But it can also be like negative style of dynamics. So it's not that clearly just acting or versus no acting, or acting at a community level versus not being acted upon. Then it's mostly going dynamic on a diagonal, if you look at it. So this is highly acting, just one organization and so on. And on the structuration perspective, this is basically organizations being caught in the loop and being caught in the hegemonic forces of grand challenges and causing them, but also being highly affected by them. Okay.
Thanks.
I hope that answers it.
We've got 7 minutes left for general discussion. So any more questions about any of the papers or the links between them? Any reflections we want to sort of take away? Could I ask a question, Madalina, on your paper? It was about the relationship between wicked problems and grand challenges. They're almost kind of treated the same sometimes. And I wondered, your idea of scales really grabbed me, because there's this, obviously not all grand challenges are the same, right? COVID, financial crisis, climate change, they escalate, and we've got this kind of inflation that everything becomes a grand challenge. And I just wondered whether, rather than seeing wicked problems and grand challenges as the same phenomena, maybe wicked problems is a good lens to sort of unpack and zoom in on aspects of grand challenges, right? That where there is indeterminacy, where they are tangled and complex, and because that all comes from policy decisions, right? Wicked problems comes from policy decisions. Camillus talks about wicked problems as strategic problems. So we could, maybe there's a complementary relationship between wicked problems and grand challenges that we could unpack, rather than just treating them as the same thing and everything gets a bit blurred. I see personally grand challenges as the big complex system problems, right? That are kind of intractable, but within that we can zoom in without falsely breaking things apart and oversimplifying.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thing, and it's one of the relationships that we are struggling with at the moment. Actually, we were even thinking if to actually make the paper about the differences between grand challenges and wicked problems in the literature. So what we find is that there's 3 ways of conceptualizing it in literature. Either it's the same, so they say grand challenges or wicked problems, or such or wicked problems, which can be conceptualized as wicked problems. They say, well, grand challenges which are formed by with wicked problems are part of it. So as you said, so there's multiple wicked problems that create a grand challenge, but some of them even say that grand challenges are opposed to wicked problems, where grand challenges are solvable while wicked problems are not solvable. But I think that one of the, it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And this is especially a lot of the, some policy papers and technical papers or future-oriented papers, future technology analysis papers look into this. So I think, but I think you're very right that a lot of the attributes of wicked problems are said to be part of, are the same attributes as the grand challenge in themselves. And then, of course, the idea is how do you break them up then? So, and the idea of scaling is one of the key elements in there. But I think the scaling element is also a very weird one, because it's also, okay, scale from what perspective? Is it scale in terms of geographic scaling, temporal scaling? We talk a little bit in the paper about that. Is it even the affected population, or is it the multiple dimensions that are going into it? So it's multiple elements that go into it.
It reminds us as well of Niccolini's kind of zooming in and zooming out at the same time, right? We need both. Let me open any other reflections or comments. How are we doing for time? We've only got a couple of minutes left. Any final thoughts or reflections before I close? Okay, I think I'll close. I just want to say thank you to all the presenters. I think wonderful set of papers, very nicely linked between them. It's great work, and it's been a really good conversation. I only wish we had more time to discuss and unpack some of the papers and have more discussion, but we have to work within the constraints. So thank you very much to all the presenters. Thank you for everyone who's asked questions, engaged with the session, and enjoy the rest of today and the rest of the conference. So I'm going to close now. Thank you.